Hello, everyone. My name is Lisa Kerr, and this is my older adult oral video presentation for Social Work 501, Human Behavior and the Social Environment. We will begin by talking about briefly Erik Erikson's developmental stage. Identify and briefly describe the chosen developmental stage of Erikson's theory of development. Erik Erikson's theory of psychological development states that an individual goes through 8 stages of development throughout their life. In my older adult interview, I chose to focus on stage 6. In this stage, the individual is going through young adulthood. This stage usually can typically begin around 18 or 19 and go in towards the 30s. Isolation versus intimacy is the main theme within this stage of development. So we are asking ourselves, can we form and be in strong, committed relationships and develop a sense of deep intimacy with that partner while also not losing a sense of self? So in this presentation, we will dive deeper on this specific stage of development with the older adult that I chose to interview. Discuss important experiences in the interviewee's life from the chosen developmental stage. First, I'd like to introduce my interviewee. The person that I chose to interview was my mother. My mother was born in Kingston, Jamaica, and she was intended to be born at home in her grandmother's house, which would be my great-grandmother's house. But it turned out that she had to be rushed to the hospital because when my grandmother, which is her mother, was giving birth to her, she was only 17 years old, and there was some complications that arose during the home birth. And the midwife that was present couldn't resolve those complications. So my mother and my grandmother were rushed to University Hospital. My mother disclosed that when she was born, due to the complications and my grandmother losing a lot of blood, my grandmother had to have a hysterectomy. And this resulted in my mother being my grandmother's only child. With that, my mother disclosed in our interview that she deeply believes that her being an only child affected her development till this day. She explained that she remembers growing up and she was extremely lonely often, and she had trouble making friends. And now, as she has become an older adult, she described that she often does wish she had a sibling to bond with in adulthood and to reminisce with, and to also ultimately help her care for her mother, because now my grandmother's of old age, and my mother is helping to care for her. So moving on, my mother disclosed that during her young adulthood stage, she went to community college for 1 year, but then had to drop out. She described that growing up, she grew up with not a lot of financial resources, and her mother could no longer afford to send her to community college anymore. So that's why she dropped out. When she was at community college, she was learning a trade, and she was learning skills to become a secretary. So typing skills, clerical skills of that nature. My mother also went on to describe that during her late adolescence, before she became a young adult, she met her father. Throughout her childhood, she was not raised with her father. She was raised by just my grandmother, and later on my grandmother married, and she then became raised by my grandmother and her stepdad. My mother described that her father, her biological father, left Jamaica and went to England before she was born. And the first time that she met him in person was when she was 15 years old. And she described that as a very awkward encounter. And she described that she did not necessarily know how to feel. Later on, after she dropped out of community college due to not being able to afford it anymore, she described that her mother grew worrisome of her, and decided to end up teaching her sewing. And my grandmother was a seamstress, so she was a really good sewer. So she began to teach my mom how to sew. My mom described that she met the love of her life at age 19. And then she became pregnant at age 23. And eventually got her heart broken by the same man at age 28. And later on, towards her end of her young adulthood, she moved on from that broken relationship and got married and migrated to America at age 36. Here I will be discussing the difficult challenges and accomplishments in my mother's life through her young adulthood. My mom, as I said before, was raised in a poor environment in a developing country. She experienced an immense level of childhood stressors, such as having to drop out of community college due to not being able to afford it. She also experienced unplanned pregnancy at age 23, with her first child. And as stated before, she experienced tremendous heartbreak with that relationship. Some major accomplishments that she discussed with me were that she successfully delivered her first child, and she got married and eventually migrated to the United States, which was a really big goal of hers. Once she was in the United States, she became a citizen within a year. And then within a few years after becoming a citizen, she was able to file for my grandmother to come to the United States and get her green card. And she describes specifically filing for my grandmother and getting my grandmother to come visit the United States as one of her biggest accomplishments in life. Here I'll briefly describe the psychological crisis of this young emerging adulthood that my mother went through. My mother described that the biggest crisis of her young adulthood was becoming a mother at 23 and getting her heart broken. She met her first love at the age of 19 When she met him, she found out that he was cohabitating with another woman, but he was not married. And this other woman was not her. My mother lived with my grandmother while she was dating my sister's dad. She became pregnant at 23, and she stated that she was very terrified, mostly because she was unprepared to become a mother. She had no job, and she mostly also was scared to tell her mom that she became pregnant because she was uncertain how my grandmother would react. My mother displayed a sense of strong self-regulation through her use of attentional control while dating her first child's father. She focused her attention on his promise to marry her. And what I mean by this is that despite my mother knowing that her first love was cohabitating with another woman, she held on to the promise that he gave her that he was going to marry her. And she kind of disregarded what people may see as infidelity, and she thought that he was eventually going to choose her because she had his first child. And self-regulation refers to the ability of one, how one manages how they respond to outside or internal stimuli. And the outside stimuli within this situation was the other woman that he was messing with. Here we will discuss biopsychological factors or events that may have inhibited or facilitated the resolution of this crisis that my mother was going through. And the crisis was becoming a young mom and also dealing with heartbreak. My mother had my eldest sister at 23, and she continued to live with my grandmother and my step grandfather because she was not financially stable enough to move out. She tried working when my sister was a toddler, but then was later told to stop working by my sister's father. We see here that culturally, my mother was expected to sacrifice a tremendous amount to fully care for her child. My mother wasn't afforded much opportunities while living in Jamaica due to living poor. My grandmother was a seamstress and my step-grandfather was a shoe cleaner. So income was at times inconsistent. While they could always have enough for food, they had to get creative with other sources of income. This poverty that she lived in often brought on stress, and in stress within her interparental conflicts. The poverty